About 2 months back now, I was kinda frustrated with the lack of options in the War Dogs kit. So, I resolved to fix that myself by making these things. Although at this point they're only sculpted, I have to say that these are some of the most exciting models I've ever had my hands on. They have so much potential to be so gross and horrid in all the ways that I love that I just can't wait to see them painted. To keep things easy, I'm leaving as many armor panels as I can separate. I already know it's going to be awkward to try and paint the endoskeletons of these beasts with them in the way, so I'm just tagging them onto some toothpicks. Last video, when I was working on attaching Big Bird's feathers to his armor panels, I was kinda worried about the feathers getting in the way of reassembling him, so I did already glue most of those down. It's a little unfortunate because I already know this is going to cause some problems later on, but I also feel like this was the safer option, so I don't really regret it. To keep from painting over Big Bird's eyes, which would completely ruin the entire point of using cabochons, I just used some more blue tack to cover them. With that minor amount of preparation done, I can go ahead and start priming the models. This time, of course, using Vallejo's amazing black primer through my airbrush. I didn't worry about getting perfect coverage with my primer on Tyndalos's rocks. Nothing is really going to scratch paint off the recesses, and it would take forever to try and get into all those tiny cracks. Undeniably, the largest surface area on these models comes from the skeletons, which are going to end up being that typical steel you see on knights. I went ahead and loaded my airbrush with some dark steel and gave them a thorough spray. For the most part, I ignore the areas that don't need to be silver, like the feathers and the fur. Yeah, these will inevitably get some overspray, but giving everything a consistent coat is honestly just a waste of time here. Next, I grabbed a chunk of sponge and started stippling on a light silver. I go pretty heavy-handed with this step, as it'll get darkened down nicely in a moment. Remember when I said that the armor panels were gonna get in the way and make painting the skeletons much harder? Good times. To keep things easy, I'm leaving as many armor panels as I can separate. Yeah, so I was right. Big Bird here has his arms and armor in the way, meaning it's actually pretty hard to make sure my sponge is reaching some of the crevices. Luckily, this will be mostly hidden by shadow, but this, again, might cause issues later. Next, I want to go ahead and add some grime and depth to the shadows, which means giving both of these a good old wash of Agrax. I thinned this down some to make sure that the coffee staining isn't too bad in the end, and slapped it onto all of the undercarriage. When that dried, I followed up with another lighter pass of bright silver, this time only focusing on the raised edges and surfaces. Werewolves and night skies are such an iconic duo that are always seen together, like Nintendo in making bad decisions. I want to invoke some of that connection through my paint scheme without entirely relying on a dark color palette. So, here, I'm going to go with a nice sky blue. I'm going to start off by basing the armor panels with a purple. Yes, that will make sense in a second. This specific color from Procurl doesn't have amazing coverage, especially not over black, but I do love the shade in the finish, so I tough it out. 2 layers will be fine, as this doesn't need to be completely perfect. Next, I grab another chunk of sponge and stipple on some dark blue. If you're also using this technique, remember that your paint needs to be fairly thin, about 1:1 with water, and not overloaded with paint. Get some of the paint out onto a napkin before you start hitting your model with the sponge. With this coat, we want to make sure that we're covering up most of that purple that we just laid down. So why even start with purple? Well, as I'm sure you're aware by now, all acrylic paints are translucent to some varying degree. Although our end goal is a decently bright blue, by starting with purple, we end up with a level of depth that we otherwise couldn't get using just blues alone. After that dries, I stipple on a true blue. To keep my contrast from being too stark, I thinned my paint down even more than before and did this step in 2 layers, covering a little less the second time. Then, over the course of 3 more layers, I mix in progressive amounts of ivory, making each layer just a little bit brighter than the last. This looks great so far, but to really tie my layers together, I hit the armor with a glaze of very thin Talazar blue before giving one final highlight of bright ass blue, trademark pending. At this point, I was still kinda kicking around what color I wanted to do for the trim, so I just moved on to the fur. Painting fur is really easy, as it's the perfect canvas for dry brushing. I start off by base coating everything in a dark, warm gray before quickly realizing I missed 2 armor panels on the back. Damn it, let me just fix that real quick. Okay, moving on. I grabbed a neutral gray and gave all of the fur a pretty heavy dry brushing of it. Then I did a light gray, covering less of the fur and focusing more on the top facing surfaces, like down the center of the back. Finally, I hit the brightest points with a coat of pure ivory and felt like this was missing something? I don't know, it's a little too clean. I think it needs some grime. So I grabbed a handful of washes, Pro Acryl's Brown and Flesh, and GW's Mortarian Grime. I thinned these down and slapped them on randomly, making sure to mix them together where they met and feathering them out with a damp brush where they felt just a bit too stark. After the wash had a little bit of time to dry, I redid the light gray and ivory steps before moving on. After I had a bit of time to think, I finally settled on what I want to do for the trim. I hit all of it with a base coat of black mixed in with a tiny bit of that same purple from before, making sure to be very careful around the edges. Mixing black over blue doesn't sound very fun. Then I thinned down some of my pure purple and started layering. When you're layering, especially on large, smooth surfaces like this, it's incredibly easy to get jagged, splotchy layers. We want to make sure that we're not jumping up in brightness too intensely or too quickly, otherwise that's going to give us a strange texture that's kinda... Wait a minute. No, that's not right at all. Did I just forget what I was painting? Anyways, as I was saying, the last thing we want is for the trim to not match the style of the rest of the model. So, I made sure I was stippling with a brush here, as a sponge would be a bit too unwieldy on areas this small. With that layer done, I mixed in some neutral gray and did another pass. By taking this mix and adding some light gray in, I could get brighter and brighter highlights until I was happy. Just like before, I made a glaze, this time of Magos Purple, and applied it to the entirety of the trim. To make my final highlights properly desaturated, I mixed some black, purple, and light gray together until I thought it looked right. With one final addition of white into the mix, I hit the brightest points before moving on. Tindalos is at this point looking pretty good, so let's go ahead and get Big Bird caught up to speed. Just like before, we're going to paint these armor panels with sponge stippling. After a quick base coat of Rhinox hide, I started layering with Mournfang. Then I moved on to 2 layers of Dark Sun Yellow, 2 layers of Ivory, and tied everything together with a thin wash of Agrax. After the wash dried, I did one more pass of ivory before finishing the armor with a tiny touch of pure white. For the feathers, I think a nasty yellow green would look kinda awesome. So I'll start off using some of this Vallejo yellow green to base coat my... Oh, this stuff isn't covering great at all. So I'll start off by using some of this dark umber as an undercoat. Then I'll go ahead and base coat the feathers with some of this Vallejo yellow green. I'm not entirely sure what the best method for painting these feathers is yet, as, well, I've never sculpted any, but I would imagine that just like the fur before, dry brushing is gonna be my best bet. Using a mix of warm yellow and my previously used yellow-green, I layer up, working my way to pure warm yellow. For something with a bit of a smoother surface like this, you don't want to just grind your brush into a napkin. Doing so will just dry out your brush, leaving nothing but pigment powder behind. Keep your brush slightly damp, wipe it onto a plastic or texture palette until you're leaving behind very little paint, and then start hitting your model. I mixed in some ivory to my warm yellow and focused just on the top halves of the feathers before finishing things with a bit of pure ivory. Originally, I was just going to leave this here, but man, this is kinda flat. So let's glaze in some orc flesh here, making sure to give the whole feather some love, but focusing mostly on the bottoms. I did a few layers of this, really bringing the intensity up at the base. I then repeated the previous yellow steps, working up from warm yellow to a mix of ivory to pure ivory before giving the whole thing another glaze, this time of a Yandan yellow. I know that sounds like a lot of work for one tiny little portion of this model, but honestly, I think start to finish, not including drying times, this was maybe 30 minutes of work, so it actually wasn't that bad. Probably still easier than manually layering yellow. For Big Bird's trim, I want to keep things simple. Base coat with bronze, wash with Agrax, stipple on some more bronze, and then hit some edges with a mix of bright silver and bronze. Easy. With both models armor finished, I can move on to the common colors once again. I may as well do the exhausts now, which I'm going to keep pretty simple. Paint the top segments bronze, wash, and then dry brush to re-establish some highlights. I want to make sure the flesh on these models looks rotten and sickly, so to do that, I'm going to go ahead and start with some purple undertones. Straight purple wouldn't have had the right fleshy notes that I wanted, so I mixed in some burnt red to make my base coat. I then mixed in some tan flesh and gave everything a coat of dry brushing. For the tendon things on the legs, I instead stippled the paint on with a brush to help it give it some texture and added interest. After, I did another layer, mixing in just a little bit more tan flesh this time. I then added some pale pink to my mix and did another layer just as before. I wanted to give the flesh a little bit of added visual interest and depth, so I gave everything a pretty thick wash by mixing together some Blood Angel's red and Mago's purple, really leaning into the red for this step. This was done to get things looking bloody and wet before adding my gore effects later on. I then repeated the two previous layers of pink, fleshy colors to bring back some of the brightness that was lost in the wash. At this point, I finally felt safe removing the blue tack from Big Bird's eyes, and oh no, he's awful. Oh, I love him. Now to start making these fellas look properly warp-touched, I started slapping gore down on a lot of that exposed flesh. Around the eyes, the base of the feathers, Tyndalos' neck, etc, etc. I did leave his midriff clean for now so that I can add a few other colors of wire later. To add a bit of extra grossness to Big Bird, I took some of this Vallejo vomit paint, which is quickly becoming one of my favorites ever, and slapped it around some of the deeper recesses of flesh. Now, Tyndalos' skull could use a little bit of work. I went ahead and base coated it with Rhinox hide. I then did my usual method of painting bone, moving to stippling on layers of Mournfang. Aged bone is a bit tricky to get right. It moves from dark to light pretty quick while still having a good bit of color depth. Just make sure you're working in slow, controlled layers and you'll be fine. My next step is to use some dark sun yellow, making sure to cover a good bit of my previous Mournfang layers. Like I said, quick transitions from dark to light. Finish it off, I stipple on a bit of pure ivory. To give the models a little bit more detail, I picked out a few random pipes, wires, and general greebles in a few different colors. These aren't getting more effort than this, and just serve to make my knights feel a little bit more realistic for the tiny amount of work that needs to be done. With that done, I can go ahead and move on to the rust. Wait, I kinda forgot this loincloth existed. A layer of brown, some scratchy highlights, and a wash. Yeah, good enough. Anyways, rust. I used some dirty down rust here, thinning it as shown in my previous rust painting techniques video. I make sure not to go too heavy handed with this, as I want the gore to be really what grabs your attention. These models are rapidly approaching the finish line, mostly needing their bases finished at this point. My concept for my Chaos armies as a whole is that the battlefield is slowly being corrupted by their presence, causing some weird distortions to reality. To represent this, I've been bouncing between a couple of different schemes. For Big Bird, he's getting some of the mud scheme that I've used on a couple of my previous Death Guard models. I start this by slapping down Vallejo's thick mud texture paste all over the base. I want to add some puddles of toxic liquid around his base, which means I need to make some, craters, for lack of a better word. Using the back half of a brush that's been dampened, I first make some impressions in my mud that'll serve as the foundation for said puddles. Some spots were a little thin, and in those cases, I just added a little bit more mud before making my impressions. I also thought a footprint would look pretty cool, so I added that as well. Tindalos is getting a dusty desert base. For this, I'll break out some Vallejo earth and, wow! This is oddly gray. I can still work with this. I applied this on all of the top facing surfaces, mostly ignoring the sides of the rock layers. After giving both bases ample time to dry, I went back to finish Big Bird's. Some of those puddles were still looking a little anemic, so I hit the border of them with another coat of mud before tapering the outer edge to get a bit more of a realistic look. To make this piece a bit more realistic, I added some mud to the bottom of his raised foot, using a thin brush to drag some of the paste downwards to create drips. This is one of my favorite details that I've done on this model, as it really just ties him into his base and makes him feel really realistic. While that second layer dries, let's go ahead and finish off Tindalos's base. I base coated everything in dark umber before doing a few passes of dry brushing. I started off with bright umber, a mix of bright umber and ivory, and finally pure ivory. To get the base feeling nice and dusty, I used some light brown pigment powder, applying it heavily across the entire base. To create the liquid for those puddles I mentioned, I used some Vallejo water texture and added some of this awesome dollar roundy fluorescent ink. This gives a really bright, punchy color that still maintains a lot of its translucency. This should hopefully mean that it's still a bit tempered by the darkness of the mud underneath it. To apply it, I used a pipette and slowly dropped some onto the base. I went a bit crazy and added the goop across the base, not only in the puddles I made. After that, I had a few hours to dry, went back and added some of that vomit paint from before onto the top of it to give it a little bit more added depth. As I'm sitting here rapidly approaching the end of this project, I'm not entirely happy with Big Bird's armor. It's a little too bright. So I went ahead and gave it a quick, very thin glaze of Fire Slayer flesh, which got things looking a lot better. Now, the only things left to do were to paint the base rim. I just used more of that Vallejo primer from earlier to do the job. With everything all but finished, I could finally glue the armor panels on. But before I can truly call these models done, there's one last thing that I gotta do. When I first created Big Bird, I mentioned that the little drips down his face were gonna end up looking like gory, melting flesh. Right now, they just look kinda weird. So let's go ahead and bust out this Dirty Down's Gore Effect paint. I haven't used this stuff yet, but I have waited very patiently for this moment, and I gotta say, it's just about as good as I could have expected. It works very similarly to Yoo-Hoo glue, while also being a lot stronger after it dries. I just dip a toothpick into the pot, stick it to where I want the effect to start, and drag it to where I want to finish. This stuff looks amazing with just a little bit of work, which is to be expected from Dirty Down at this point. Their stuff is genuinely amazing. I also added some of the Dirty Down snot effect to add some saliva dripping from Big Bird's mouth down his tongue. And finally, after 2 videos, they're done. These took quite a while to create from start to finish, but I think these might be the models I'm most proud of in my collection. They're pretty unique in their designs, and you know what? I'd argue in some of the execution. These are easily some of the most fun I've ever had painting a project. So far, I've painted just about 500 points of Death Guard models, which is not putting me on track to have 2,000 points finished by the end of the year. But you know what? I think I might have just the model in mind to help me get up to pace. I'll see you guys next time.